Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, Brian Michael Bendis had my curiosity, and now he's got my attention. And you guys will find out why at the end of this video. But yeah, like the cliffhanger that this comic leaves us on is like nuts. It's just like, holy cow. And then we have to wait till like March 13th before the next issue comes out. And I'm kind of dying. That's one of the downsides with Bendis. He writes so much stuff, like everything becomes a monthly series when he writes it, instead of it being like bi-weekly, you know? So it's kind of like, all right, that sucks. But okay, so the return of Jonathan Kent, the return of Superman's son. Now, like we talked about in the last video, Superman's son was kind of taken on this journey through the galaxy by Superman's father, Jor-El, in order to give him a better understanding of his place in the cosmos. And when Superboy returned back to Earth, of course, he was about 5 years older. He was 17 years old, as opposed to 11 years old, so he was 6 years older. And really, Bendis kind of seems to be using this first arc, or I guess really this existing arc of Superman, to kind of tell us what Jonathan had been doing in the time that he was out in space. But the issue is that Jonathan comes along and basically says, Dad, your father's insane. Like, you know, Jor-El of Krypton is insane. Now, this is kind of the cool thing here. And the reason why Jonathan sort of comes to this conclusion, or at least it kind of seems to be head on the nose here, is that Jor-El's sort of questioning his existence. And this makes sense, right? He's basically having like an existential crisis, because Jor-El is a guy who was rooted in science, right? Like by all standards of measurement, Jor-El should be dead. He was supposed to have been killed when Krypton exploded. Now, we as the reader know that Dr. Manhattan yanked him out at the last moment when Krypton blew up, just to kind of see what happens, presumably just sort of see what takes place, to just kind of watch how the pieces unfold and so on and so forth. Just kind of this big grand experiment. But Jor-El doesn't know that. As far as Jor-El's aware, just some higher powers basically saved him from the destruction of Krypton, and he can't explain it. Now, this is the reason why Jor-El has this existential crisis, because when he's talking to Jonathan, when Jonathan's asking questions, you know, when he says, you know, like, why did you choose to come here and all that kind of good stuff, and Jonathan's talking about how he's here for the purpose of like understanding the galaxy and things like that, Jor-El begins to sort of hit at this idea that like it was a mistake to bring Jonathan. And the reason why is because the two of them were on a sort of mission of self-discovery in and of themselves, where Jonathan is there in order to understand his place in the cosmos, to understand how insignificant Earth is in relation to like everything that goes on in the galaxy and the greater universe. Jor-El's there in order to kind of find answers. But what he does is he asks Jonathan, what if there are no answers? And the reason why is because Jor-El is a guy whose entire life was immersed in science, right? I mean, kind of moving away from the comic for a second and looking at Jor-El as he is, Jor-El was a guy who was immersed in science. I mean, he was like the scientific mind on Krypton. He was the one who knew Krypton was going to come to an end. He was the one who told the Kryptonian Science Council we have to do something to stop it. But he was also the guy who was considered to be full of heresy and full of nonsense, and ultimately dismissed by the Science Council, only for them to realize how stupid they were when the planet blew up. And well, I guess Bendis kind of changed that with Rogolzar. I'm sorry, Bendis, but that was a stupid idea. But the fact remains here that with this whole thing, Jor-El's a guy who comes from the concept, comes from the ideology that everything can be explained by science, right? And that's really the nature of the Kryptonians. Kryptonians didn't really believe in like gods and deities. They didn't really believe in like a power outside of their ability to comprehend and explain. Everything could be explained through science. Religion was kind of reminiscent of a bygone age, right? You know, religion is a byproduct of people's inability to explain what goes on around them, and so they just chalk it up to religion and just call it a day. It's a lazy man's explanation. Whereas science basically says there has to be a reason why this exists. Let's pursue it to its end and find out what it is. And if we can't find an answer, that means we have to push our knowledge further until we can. The pursuit of knowledge is what gives existing knowledge and makes a society better. That's how Kryptonians viewed themselves. But with Jor-El, he looks at what's going on, kind of looks at his existence and says, I should be dead. And some higher power that I can't explain, that has not manifested itself to me, save me from my own destruction. In the face of a possible deity out there, I'm kind of left with no real answers. He's literally rigid and structured, unable to adapt to the fact that something beyond science exists out there that basically resurrected him, or you know, at least saved him from his own death. Now, that's Jor-El's perspective. We know Dr. Manhattan was the one who did it, so there's a scientific explanation. A giant blue guy who can manipulate atoms and walks around with his penis hanging out saved Jor-El from being killed. Like we know that explanation is there. Jor-El just doesn't know. And so it's kind of crazy when it comes to this whole scenario. But what it's done is thrown Jor-El into an existential crisis, caused him to question everything around him. And because of that, it's just kind of like, what's even the point of anything anymore? And that's kind of the funny scenario here is, again, so rigid, so structured, unable to adapt. And at that moment, Jonathan Kent sat down and said, I have to get out of here. Like, I've got to leave this place. This guy's just a crazy dude, basically. You know, he's just kind of going on these inane ramblings and so on and so forth. There's really nothing to him at all. So again, it's kind of intriguing here. But again, with Superman and Lois really putting Jonathan Kent through the rigors, more or less, testing his DNA, testing his brain patterns, and verifying verifying that he is actually Jonathan Kent. Of course, that being verified is actually being the case. And then what he basically does is he essentially says, now I have to tell you the rest of the story. You guys want to know what happened? I will tell you what happened. What Jonathan says is, after a while, time just kind of seemed to blur together. And the reason why is because Jonathan Kent's understanding of time was relative to like the days passing on Earth, right? Like it's Monday. We know that because that day's called Monday, the sun sets, the sun rises, now it's Tuesday. And so because of that, when he's out in space, out in the rigors of space, when you're flying through, and the sun doesn't really rise or set, the days just kind of blur together after a while. Not only that, it was constant distractions. There were always missions to go on. There was always somebody out there needing help for Jonathan Kent and for Jor-El to go out and assist, to face off against, whatever the case may be. And so because that was always going on, they were constant, like Jonathan just sort of lost track of time. And so some amount of time had passed, and it's really Brian Michael Bendis's way of saying it doesn't really matter here. And in reality, it doesn't. It doesn't really matter how much time had passed, in this particular instance, because what matters is what actually went on behind the scenes. And what was going on behind the scenes is that in this, event that involved, the Thanagarians, and involved like the Green Lantern Corps with Jonathan meeting Kilowog and meeting Arisia, it's cool to see this because he's basically meeting like members of the Corps that he would never meet, right? Like Jonathan's, his understanding of the Green Lantern Corps is limited to like Hal Jordan and like the one time he met him. And so outside of that, like the Green Lanterns are just kind of these beings who exist out there. Not only that, it's kind of cool because when Jonathan's talking about this, when he's meeting with the Green Lanterns and he's talking to them, they kind of consider Earthlings to be a hassle, right? Like, look, all Earthlings really do is screw things up because they're really not that advanced. They're basically, a primitive race fumbling and bumbling their way through the universe, causing more problems than they are helping anything. Not only that, Superman's really the only Earthling they know, which kind of makes sense because Superman's really the only one who leaves Earth and travels out there outside of like Hal Jordan, John Stewart, Guy Gardner, and Kyle Rayner. So for the most part, all they really know is Superman. But it's interesting because with Jonathan being Superman's son, they're just kind of like, okay, we'll give you a little bit of leeway here. But again, for reasons that aren't necessarily explained here, Jor-El seems to be, kind of hesitant about the idea of Jonathan running into and meeting Green Lanterns, and in turn spends what seems to be like a year never talking to Jonathan. He doesn't say a word to him. Bendis kind of leaves it to our own imagination here. I mean, we're kind of left to assume they never really met, they never really did anything, they just kind of free floated through the galaxy for about a year or so, or maybe they went on missions, we don't really know. But Jonathan talks about how he had basically listened for anything that was coming from Earth, any bit of news, anything like that, and didn't really get anything. And again, that makes sense because when you're talking about the greater universe, the greater galaxy in DC Comics, Earth is exceedingly primitive, right? Like you're talking about a planet of people who have just barely scraped the surface of like interstellar travel. Humanity, for the most part, has sent like men to the moon. They've taken one step towards the door. They haven't even gotten outside yet. Whereas you're talking about races and various civilizations out there that can travel the spaceways, move exceedingly fast, travel from one side of the universe to the other. You're talking about like a whole other side of the cosmos out there that's way beyond what Earth is technologically. And so with humanity being so primitive and being so basic, there really is nothing out there. There's really no reason for anyone to ask any questions about Earth because no one really knows anything about it. And if they did, from what Jonathan tells us, the only thing they know is Superman. So again, like it's really having no idea what's going on in his immediate surroundings, having no idea what's really going on with regards to like Earth and so on and so forth, how things are progressing. And so while Jonathan and Jor-El are making their way through, whatever's going on at the time, and Jor-El begins to address Superboy, what he does is he basically says, I'm sorry for what's about to happen. And the inclination seems to be here, at least from what Brian Michael Bendis does, is he seems to toy with the idea that Jor-El did this on purpose, that he basically flew them towards a black hole, and then Superboy was caught in the vortex and ripped out. And it seems to be intentionally done by Jor-El. We don't really know why, we don't really understand if that's exactly the case, but it would certainly go towards the idea that Jor-El's lost his mind. Now, this is when I say Brian Michael Bendis most certainly has my attention. The reason for this is because when Superboy basically flies through this black hole and ends up on the other side, that what he does is he crash lands on this giant place somewhere, but then he's met with the arrival of the Crime Syndicate of America. Superboy, Jonathan Kent, has basically traveled to a different dimension and ended up in Earth 3. He's in a different universe now. He's literally left one universe and traveled to another. He's in Earth 3, where all the heroes are villains and all the villains are heroes. I'm actually very excited to see what happens next. I know a lot of people are going to ask questions like, well, isn't the Crime Syndicate supposed to be dead, so on and so forth? Sure, I guess, but it's Brian Michael Bendis. He just kind of does what he wants to, and we have no idea if he flew through a black hole and went back in time. We won't know until we actually find out in the next story. Undoubtedly, people are going to kind of jump to conclusions and assume their opinions are right. I don't know. I'm kind of curious to see where we end up going here. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.